In this video, we will look at every person executed in the United States during the month of June. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On June 10, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Floyd Wainwright was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. It all started on April 27, 1994, when Carmen Gayhart didn't show up to pick up her two kids from daycare. She was 23 years old, a nursing student in Lake City, Florida, and a mother of two young children aged 5 and 3. But that afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. Just 2 days before Carmen vanished, 23-year-old Anthony Wainwright and 31-year-old Richard Hamilton broke out of a minimum security prison in Carteret County, North Carolina. Here, Anthony had been serving a 10-year sentence for burglary, while Richard was in for armed robbery, with 25 years to go. But neither of them planned to finish their time. After their escape, they stole a Cadillac and broke into a home where they took 2 rifles on their way out. Then they hit the road heading south to Florida, armed, dangerous, and ready to destroy anyone in their path. But the stolen car couldn't keep up. It overheated just outside Lake City, Florida, and Anthony and Richard were stranded. And that's when they saw her. Carmen was loading groceries into her Ford Bronco in a Winn-Dixie parking lot, about to pick up her children from daycare, and she never saw them coming. Richard and Anthony moved fast. They cornered her, pulled a gun, forced her into the Bronco, and took off north on I-75, out of town, out of reach. Behind a truck stop off State Route 6, deep in the woods, they dragged Carmen out of the car, and that's when both men assaulted her. When it was over, Anthony wrapped his hands around Carmen's throat and began to squeeze, and he didn't stop. But that wasn't enough for him. To make sure she was dead, he grabbed a .22 rifle and fired 2 shots into her head. Insurance, in his words. Then they left her there in the woods, like she meant nothing, and drove off. By the time her family realized she hadn't shown up to pick up the kids, alarm bells went off fast. Her husband, her father, and classmates all searched, but there was no sign of her. And by the end of the day, she was officially reported missing. The next day, April 28th, a trooper spotted Carmen's car in a quiet neighborhood near Brookhaven, Mississippi. Trooper John Leggett didn't know who he was tailing, not yet, but something felt off. Richard and Anthony were circling the streets in a stolen Bronco, and when they looped around again, John followed, quietly and at a distance. But it didn't take long for things to explode. Suddenly, shots rang out from the back of the stolen Bronco, and within seconds, John's windshield was lit up, blasted with more than 40 shotgun pellets. But John managed to follow them down a dead-end road near a local school, and when the Bronco stopped, John grabbed his shotgun and got ready. Then the SUV turned around, gaining speed and coming straight at him. But John didn't move. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot hit Richard in the face, and Anthony took a round in the shoulder. The Bronco veered off and crashed. And just like that, it was over. Both men were pulled from the wreck and taken into custody, bloodied but alive. When the dust settled, officers inspected the Ford Bronco. It was indeed the same SUV they'd used to flee Florida, but Carmen wasn't inside. She was still missing. After his arrest, Anthony dropped a bombshell. First, he told officers he had AIDS. Then he admitted something even worse. He said he assaulted Carmen after robbing and kidnapping her, knowing full well he was infected. But when it came to the murder, he pointed the blame at Richard, saying it was him who strangled and shot her. But Richard talked too and also gave a full confession. However, his story didn't match the story Anthony had told. He told detectives both he and Anthony had raped Carmen. Then he sketched out a rough map showing where they had left her body. Nothing precise, just a memory of a place buried deep in the woods, off any main road, remote and hidden. And in his version, Anthony was the one who pulled the trigger. A few days later, on May 2nd, 1994, a dispatcher named Tina Wheeler studied the hand-drawn map and recognized something. It looked like a stretch of woods near State Route 6 in Hamilton County. And before sunrise, two deputies, Mel Black and Albert Jones, headed out to take a look. Around 4:30 a.m., Albert caught a foul, unmistakable scent drifting through the trees. And by sunrise, they finally had found her. Carmen had been there for days, left in the brush, exposed to the heat, and badly decomposed. Her remains were taken to the District 4 Medical Examiner's office in Jacksonville. During the autopsy, Dr. Margarita Arusa noticed something disturbing. Carmen's body was missing several teeth and her hyoid bone, a small bone in the neck often broken in cases of strangulation. That's when investigators returned to the scene. After carefully combing the area, they found the missing teeth and the hyoid bone buried in the dirt. And that confirmed what they already knew. Carmen's final moments had been brutal. After his arrest in Mississippi, Anthony agreed to return to Florida willingly. Back in custody, prosecutors struck a deal with him and his lawyer. The state wouldn't seek the death penalty if he met three conditions. First, he had to prove he didn't take part in Carmen's murder. Second, he had to be fully honest with investigators. And third, he had to pass a polygraph. For nearly 2 weeks, between May 9th and May 20th, 1994, Anthony cooperated. He gave multiple statements and even helped investigators recover pieces of evidence tied to the case. But on May 20th, when he was brought to the state attorney's office, everything changed. After a brief talk with his lawyer, Anthony admitted, plainly for the first time, that he had assaulted Carmen. And when asked to take the lie detector test, he flat out refused. Then came the lab results. A DNA sample taken from bodily fluid on the backseat of Carmen's car matched his. Anthony and Richard were both charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, and robbery. And throughout the trial, neither Anthony nor Richard showed remorse. Richard sometimes even smirked and blew kisses, as if it were all a joke. In May 1995, two separate juries heard their cases, and both returned with death sentences. And the judge agreed. On June 12, 1995, the court didn't hold back. They called the crime pitiless and unnecessarily torturous, and also wicked, evil, and vile. Both men were sentenced to die in the electric chair, plus 3 life sentences for the rest of their crimes. For years, both men kept appealing the sentence every chance they got, but every court, state and federal, shut them down. Anthony even brought forward new DNA evidence, hoping for a change. But it wasn't enough. The facts still stood. Then, on January 13, 2023, the case quietly closed for one of them. Richard Hamilton died in prison of natural causes at the age of 59. The official cause of death was never made public, but after nearly 30 years on death row, his time ran out before the state ever carried out the sentence. Then, after spending more than 30 years on death row, Anthony's final day came. On the morning of June 10, 2025, he woke up around 3:30 a.m. inside Florida State Prison. Officials offered him a last meal, but he politely declined. He spent his last hours with 2 visitors, his fiancée, Samantha, and his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood. But as the clock moved forward, so did his fear. According to the Reverend, Anthony was very afraid of what was coming. While strapped to the gurney, he was asked if he had any final words. Anthony turned to the victim's family first. "I hope my death brings you peace and healing," he said. But then his tone shifted. He called his court-appointed attorney Florida's worst and said the justice system in the state was broken beyond repair. "Please continue the fight," he told those opposing the death penalty, "because I can promise you they are not going to let up. They will continue to murder if we continue to let it happen." Most of his final words, though, were for his fiancée Samantha, the woman who had taken his last name, even though they were never legally married. "You are the love of my life. I'm so blessed we found each other," he told her. "The years we have spent together have been beyond wonderful. They have been downright magical. Love is stronger than death, and I know our love will last for eternity." The drugs started flowing at 6:10 p.m. Anthony's shoulders shuddered once, then again. He blinked hard, pulled in a few sharp breaths, then stopped moving altogether. By 6:14, he lay completely still. At 6:22 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Anthony Floyd Wainwright was 54 years old. At that exact moment, another execution was unfolding in Alabama. A different state, a different method, but the same final outcome. Gregory Hunt had spent almost 30 years on death row, and the story that led him to die by nitrogen gas was just as haunting. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1988, paramedics stepped into a small apartment in Cordova, Alabama, and into a scene that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Karen Lane, just 29, lay lifeless on the kitchen floor. Her body was battered beyond recognition, covered in bruises, broken bones, and injuries too graphic for words. Even seasoned first responders froze in the doorway, and some struggled to speak. The violence was overwhelming, and nothing about the scene felt random. Right away, suspicion turned to Gregory Hunt. Karen had only been dating him for a few weeks. They met through a mutual connection, Tina Gilliland Cook, who happened to be both Karen's roommate and Greg's cousin. At first, Greg seemed quiet, maybe just withdrawn. But that changed fast. His temper started surfacing early on. His jealousy, his need for control, his angry outbursts. And by the end of July, the tension inside that apartment had reached a boiling point. Karen had seen enough, and she told her friends she wanted him out of her life. On the night of August 1st, just after 6 p.m., Greg showed up at the apartment again. He was agitated, pacing, and on edge. He turned to a friend, Shirley Romine, and said, "She makes me so mad I could kill that bitch." Then he added he was done with it all, said he was going back to Miami. But he didn't leave, not yet. That evening, Karen and Tina drove out to Parrish, headed for the home of Tina's fiancé. But as they pulled up, they noticed Greg's van already there. Tina went inside, but Karen didn't. She took off without a word, fast, deliberate, like something had shifted. Inside, Greg noticed. He asked where Karen went, and Tina told him she was heading to her mom's. That was all she knew. But Greg didn't believe her. By 9:45 p.m., he was on the phone, screaming. His voice shook with rage. He demanded answers, wanted to know where Karen was. "You better tell me," he warned, "or it's going to be detrimental to you." Then came the part no one forgot. He said he didn't care if he went back to prison, not if that's what it took. Over the next few hours, Greg unraveled fast. The anger didn't fade. It morphed into something darker. He called a friend and said he was going to f somebody up. Then he rang Karen's mother twice, claimed he was just trying to find her. But the way he spoke, sharp, bitter, wired with tension, said something else. He told her he had grown up in violence and knew how to use it. Then he hung up and went hunting. He drove to a house Karen owned but hadn't lived in for months. And when he noticed she wasn't there, something in him snapped. He soaked the place in gas and lit it up. About an hour later, he showed up at the home of another friend, Deborah, still asking where Karen was. Deborah later said that Greg smelled like smoke and gasoline, and that he confessed to burning down Karen's house. He said that he was sick of her crap, and that he had taken the only thing she had. But still, he wasn't done. Around midnight, a witness saw Greg's van tearing through Cordova, chasing a car that looked just like Karen's. He was speeding, swerving through the empty streets like a man hunting something. But Karen managed to lose him, at least for a while. She thought the danger had passed and drove home, probably shaken but relieved. But what she didn't know was that Greg wasn't done. And heading back to her apartment, that decision would cost her her life. By 2 a.m., Karen had gone to bed. The apartment was dark, quiet, but Greg was still out there. A neighbor later told police she had heard glass shattering, then looked outside and saw a man, Greg, climbing through a broken window. Within minutes, he was inside. He had found Karen. Just half an hour after entering the house, he called Tina. "Karen's lying here on the kitchen floor," he said. "Someone should get her to a hospital." Then he hung up. When officers arrived, what they found inside was horrifying. Karen's body told the story before anyone could. She had been beaten with such force that nearly every bone in her chest was fractured. 12 ribs on each side were broken. Her breastbone was cracked. Her heart and lungs were bruised. Her liver was torn, and her aorta was ripped open. The autopsy later revealed 60 separate injuries. Beside her was a blood-slicked bar stool, strands of her hair still stuck to the seat, and between her legs, a broken broomstick. Forensics confirmed what everyone feared. She'd been sexually assaulted with it. And there was more. The medical examiner found Greg's DNA in her mouth. It had been left there just before she died. And when officers saw what happened in that apartment, there was no question who they needed to find: Greg. But by then, he was already gone. He'd run to Cullman, Alabama, and made a dazed call to his family in Florida. He didn't sound certain about anything. He said he and Karen had gone out that night, that they argued, and that he didn't know how he had left her. But a few days later, face to face at the jail, his sister asked him the only question that mattered: "Did you kill her?" Greg didn't flinch. "Yes," he said. He claimed he'd been drinking, said he was high and angry and that he lost control, that he snapped, that he was sorry, but by then, none of it mattered. His fingerprints were everywhere, on the stairwell, on the walls, even on a busted window screen. A bloody palm print matched him exactly. And when witnesses took the stand, the rest of the story collapsed around him. On June 19, 1990, Greg was found guilty of capital murder on 3 counts: one for killing her during a burglary, one for killing her through sexual abuse by force, and one for taking the life of a woman who by law couldn't consent. The jury vote wasn't unanimous but close, 11-1, and it was enough to send him to death row. Gregory Hunt would spend the next 29 years there, caught in the cycle of appeals. His attorneys argued he never stood a chance, not at trial and not at sentencing. They pointed to Alabama's broken capital defense system, underfunded, understaffed, and overburdened, and said no one ever told the jury about Greg's childhood, about the violence, the broken homes, the trauma that followed him through foster care and into drug addiction. That context, they said, was never given a voice. Since arriving in prison, Greg said he had become more spiritual. He spent most of his time reading the Bible, writing gospel songs, and trying to share his faith with other inmates. He described prison not as punishment, but as something closer to a hospital, a place where he finally began to heal. "It was just me, God, Bible, and worship," he said. "The Holy Spirit helped me get a right mind. That took years to get rid of the insanity." Greg admitted he used to live without God and believed he could have died many times before ever landing behind bars. That was why, he said, he wasn't afraid of dying now. "I don't know why people cry at funerals if they're going to heaven." Years later, Greg made a decision that would put his name back in the headlines. He chose nitrogen hypoxia as the way he wanted to die, a controversial method involving the inhalation of pure nitrogen gas, leading to death by oxygen deprivation, even before Alabama had created a protocol for how to use it. At the time, the state hadn't finished developing the steps for carrying out an execution by gas, but under law, inmates had the right to choose between gas, lethal injection, or the electric chair. Greg would be the 5th man in Alabama to die this way. That choice sparked new fears. Nitrogen gas had been used before, but what was once called a humane alternative now looked anything but. Witnesses described it as slow, unsettling, even painful. Critics pushed back, demanding that Alabama paused all executions until a full review could be done. But those calls were ignored, and the execution moved forward anyway. Gregory Hunt's final day came on June 10, 2025. He skipped a last dinner meal the night before, but for lunch he chose a tray of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. When the curtain pulled back at 5:52 p.m., Gregory lay strapped to the gurney, wrapped in a white sheet with a mask over his face. After the death warrant was read, Greg declined to say any final words, but did give a thumbs up and what appeared to be a peace sign. But not long before that moment, in a phone call, he had spoken plainly. At first, he insisted he wasn't your typical death row inmate. Then he said 6 words that stuck. "I don't have no pity party." He paused, then added, "You know, I'm just battling until I get a break, or they snuff my light out." When asked about the crime itself, his voice changed. "I can't explain what happened," he said quietly. "All I can say is that she didn't deserve what happened to her." On the night of June 10th, the gas started flowing sometime after 5:55 p.m. At 5:57, Greg briefly shook, gasped, and raised his head off the gurney. He let out a moan at about 5:59 p.m. and raised his feet. Then he took a series of 4 or more gasping breaths with long pauses in between. And by 6:05 p.m., he stopped moving altogether. His left fist remained clenched long afterward. Gregory Hunt was pronounced dead at 6:26 p.m. Gregory Hunt was 65 years old. Just 2 days later, the next inmate was strapped to the gurney, this time in Oklahoma. More than 25 years after he committed a brutal crime, George John Hanson was executed by lethal injection. Let's take a look at what he did. On the evening of August 31st, 1999, 77-year-old Mary Bowles was just trying to load her car outside Tulsa Promenade Mall. A retired banker and longtime hospital volunteer, she had no idea 2 armed men were watching her, waiting. Their names were George John Hanson, also known as John Fitzgerald Hanson, and Victor Miller, and by that point, they had already robbed 2 liquor stores and now needed a clean vehicle to keep going. Victor jumped behind the wheel while John shoved Mary into the back seat at gunpoint. And that's when the real nightmare began. They drove north off the main roads and into the dark. Eventually, they pulled into a dirt pit near Owasso, somewhere they thought was empty. But it wasn't. Gerald Thurman, a 44-year-old trucking company owner, was there making a delivery. He saw the car circling and knew something wasn't right. He called his nephew, gave a quick heads up, and hung up. Then, minutes later, 4 shots were fired. Victor had pulled a revolver on him, and Gerald dropped where he stood. But he didn't die right away. However, John and Victor didn't wait to see if he survived. They drove off, still with Mary trapped in the back. Somewhere along a rural stretch of road, they dragged her out. John threw her to the ground and shot her. 4 to 6 rounds from a 9mm pistol. Then they left her there, tossed beneath a pile of branches like she was nothing. It wasn't until September 7th, exactly 1 week after the attack, that searchers found Mary's body. But Gerald was discovered much earlier. Locals heard the gunshots and immediately called it in. He was still breathing when help arrived, but sadly, he never regained consciousness. He died 2 weeks later in the hospital on September 14th. By then, the killers had vanished, and no one knew who they were. After killing Mary, John and Victor took her car and drove to the Oasis Motel. John walked in, asked about a room, then left, only to return minutes later saying the car wouldn't start. The clerk lent him a screwdriver and followed him outside. There, he saw both men tinkering with the Ford, but eventually they gave up, returned the tool, and rented the room. John signed the card and even showed his driver's license. But that was the last time the clerk ever saw either of them, and the car stayed in the parking lot, untouched. Over the next few days, they kept moving, robbing a liquor store on September 3rd, then a credit union on September 8th. But the walls were closing in. On September 9th, Victor's own wife made an anonymous call, telling police they were hiding out at an Econolodge in Muskogee. And that same day, an officer also spotted Mary's car still parked at the Oasis Motel. With multiple jurisdictions now working together, officers tracked the suspects to the Econolodge and moved in. Victor surrendered quietly, but John barricaded himself in the room, and it took tear gas to force him out. Inside, officers found the murder weapons and extra ammo hidden in the toilet tank. And after that, forensics quickly sealed the case. They found John's fingerprint on the driver's seatbelt buckle in Mary's car, while Victor's print was on the front passenger side. Then came the witness that would drive the final nail in. Rashad Barnes, a friend of John's, testified that John had admitted to it all, bragging about carjacking an old lady, the kidnapping, and the killings. He said Victor shot Gerald, but it was John who pulled the trigger on Mary Bowles. Both men were charged with 2 counts of murder and several federal robbery charges, and this time there would be no escape. By the time John finally faced a jury in May 2001, almost 2 years after the attacks, his criminal record already stretched back nearly 2 decades: robbery, assault, and a life of violence. But now it was murder, and not just one, but 2 of them. In Tulsa County, the courtroom stayed quiet as prosecutors detailed the carjacking, the execution-style killing of a 77-year-old woman, and the cold-blooded shooting of an innocent trucker. John sat through it all, but showed no reaction. On May 18th, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, and on May 23rd, they made their recommendation. For Mary's murder, they wanted death, and for Gerald's, life without parole. Their message was clear: there would be no second chances. But John didn't go straight to death row. Instead, he was sent to federal court for the bank robbery charges and sentenced to life in prison. He was transferred to USP Pollock, a high-security federal prison in Louisiana. And for years, he waited there, serving federal time, while Oklahoma still held the right to carry out his execution. Victor Miller's trial came next, and it wasn't his first time in the hot seat. He had already served time for murder once before, but that sentence was reduced, and by 1997, he was a free man. However, just 2 years later, he was killing again. In 2002, he stood trial for the same crimes as his co-defendant John and was found guilty of both murders. The evidence was nearly identical as for John, and the result also the same. He received a death sentence for one and life without parole for the other. But Victor wasn't done fighting. He filed for appeals, and in 2015, Tulsa County prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. Victor was sentenced to a second term of life without parole instead. John, however, wasn't so lucky. He also fought his death sentence, but the court didn't waver. His execution was first scheduled for December 15, 2022. But the Biden administration refused to transfer him back to Oklahoma. The state sued, but a federal judge sided with the prison system and paused the execution indefinitely. But that changed in 2025. After a shift in federal leadership, new Attorney General Pam Bondi approved the transfer, and on March 3rd, John was moved to death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, and his execution date was set for June 12, 2025. At his clemency hearing on May 7th, John tried to explain himself. Speaking through a video link, his voice low but steady, John expressed remorse for his involvement in the crimes and apologized to the victims' families. "I'm not an evil person," he said. "I was caught in a situation I couldn't control. I can't change the past, but I would if I could." However, during that hearing, clemency was denied, and the execution date remained in place. Gerald Thurman's son, Jake, said the moment was long overdue. He had waited almost 26 years. Jake called his father his hero and said he still saw him in his own children's faces. He also spoke about the pain of 2022, when the execution was delayed. His mother died not long after the postponement, and she never got to see the justice she had waited for. But just days before he was supposed to die, John Hanson caught what looked like a break. An Oklahoma County judge stepped in and hit pause, temporarily halting the lethal injection that had already been set in motion. John's lawyers argued something had gone wrong at the clemency stage. They claimed John never got a fair shot in front of the Pardon and Parole Board. The vote had been close, 3-2 in favor of death, but one of those votes came from a board member who used to work for the same district attorney's office that put John on trial. That, the defense said, was a conflict of interest. And for a moment, it worked. The stay held, but only for 2 days. A higher appeals court stepped in, overturned the decision, gave the green light, and the execution moved forward. No one knows if he'd been planning it all along, or if the last-minute stay only pushed him further over the edge. But John didn't request anything special for his final meal. No favorites, no last indulgences. Just the standard tray handed out that Wednesday evening, which was chicken pot pie, 2 rolls, 2 fruit cups, and carrots. Ordinary food on an extraordinary night. Then his final morning came. On June 12, 2025, John was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Strapped to the gurney, John spoke his last words. "Just forgive me and peace to everyone." The execution began at 10:01 a.m. After the drugs began to flow, a doctor entered the death chamber at 10:06 a.m. and declared him unconscious. The process was smooth without any reported complications. He was pronounced dead at 10:11 a.m. George John Hanson was 61 years old. Just 1 day later, after spending almost 20 years on death row, Stephen Stanko was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. Stephen Stanko knew how to present himself. On the surface, he looked like a man rebuilding his life, a thoughtful, well-spoken ex-con with a book under his belt and a story to tell. But that book was born out of a decade-long sentence for assault and kidnapping handed down in 1996, of which he served nearly 9 years. After his release in 2004, Stephen headed to Myrtle Beach, where he rented a room in a quiet neighborhood. He wasn't flashy, didn't throw parties. He paid rent, though not always on time, and mostly kept to himself. His parole officer warned the landlady about his past, but she wasn't surprised. Stephen had already told her. He didn't want any secrets, at least not yet. At first, Stephen seemed to settle into life outside. He told people he was trying to move on, but that finding work with a felony record wasn't easy. He bounced between a couple of short-lived jobs, then abruptly left town, saying he was going to help care for a friend's elderly mother. But that wasn't the truth, not even close. Roughly a year after walking free, Stephen began spending long hours at the public library. He told people he was working on a book about serial killers, said he wanted to turn his life around. But his time there turned into something darker. He got close to a librarian named Laura Ling, who was 43 years old. She was kind and trusting, and eventually Stephen moved in with her and her 15-year-old daughter. Around the same time, he struck up conversations with Henry Turner, a 74-year-old library regular. Just small talk between strangers. But Henry had no idea who Stephen really was, or what he was capable of. That changed in April 2005. On April 7th, inside Laura's home, Stephen snapped. He claimed they had argued, that Laura slapped him, and that the lit cigarette in his hand got caught between his glasses and his skin, and then everything went black. He tied Laura's hands behind her back and beat her. Then he walked down the hallway toward her sleeping daughter. "Scream and I'll kill you both," he told her. She tried to reach her mother, but by the time she stepped into the bedroom, Laura was already on the floor, moaning and barely conscious. Before she could react, he struck her in the head and she blacked out. When she came to, Stephen was on top of her. She kicked, fought, clawed, but he was too strong. Afterward, he dragged her into the bedroom where Laura was still fighting to stay alive. Her daughter thought, "This is how I'm going to die." Then she saw him wrap his hands around Laura's throat, and another thought hit her. Don't let this happen. Be the girl who died saving her mom. Stephen strangled Laura, flipped her onto her stomach, and finished it. Then he turned to her daughter, took a knife, and slit her throat, twice. Then he stepped over her and walked to the shower. Calm, controlled. He claims that's when his memory came back. He checked for a pulse on both of them, but there was none. And instead of calling the police or seeking help, he packed a bag, stepped over the daughter's bleeding body, and left. He thought she was dead, but she wasn't. Bleeding and broken, the girl managed to dial 911.
Can I help you? Marcy?
I'm at my house and I've been raped.
Okay. What's your address?
Mom is dead.
Pardon?
My mom is dead.
Soon after, help arrived, but not fast enough for her mother. And Stephen, he was already gone. He had taken Laura's credit cards and some of her jewelry, then drove to Conway, straight to Henry's house. He told him his father had just died and asked if he could stay there for a while. Henry, kind as ever, didn't ask questions. He let him in. That night, Stephen slept under Henry's roof, and the next morning, April 8th, they had breakfast together, eggs, toast, and coffee. But Henry had no idea he was sharing a table with a man who had just killed his girlfriend in cold blood. Later, as Henry stood in the bathroom shaving, his back turned and completely unaware, Stephen walked in quietly, raised a gun, pressed a pillow against it to muffle the sound, and pulled the trigger. Henry dropped to the floor, wounded but still breathing, and Stephen didn't hesitate. He struck him in the head, then fired again, this time into his chest. And just like that, a quiet morning had turned into a silent execution. Stephen cleared out Henry's bank account, stole his truck, and hit the road again. And by that night, he was in Columbia, South Carolina, using the money to buy strangers drinks at local bars, smiling, charming, and blending in like he hadn't just murdered 2 people in 2 days. And after that, he drove to Augusta, Georgia. But what Stephen didn't know was that he had left behind a storm. His name was already spreading, and a nationwide manhunt had started. There even was a $10,000 reward on his head, and it was only a matter of time. In Augusta, Stephen introduced himself as a businessman who owned several Hooters restaurants. Said he was in town for the Masters golf tournament. He looked the part, confident, well-spoken, like a man with money and connections. And that's how he met her, a woman who had no reason to doubt him. He charmed her, told her stories, and went home with her. She believed what he said, because why wouldn't she? Stephen spent days living under her roof, but on April 12th, just after midnight, he vanished. By morning, the woman opened her newspaper and froze. There he was, Stephen Stanko, on the front page, wanted for a double murder. She didn't hesitate and immediately picked up the phone to call the police. Within hours, the U.S. Marshals closed in, and before Stephen could disappear from Augusta, they had him in cuffs. The man who once wrote a book from behind bars was sent back, and this time for good. When investigators searched his home, they found something that shook even the most seasoned officers. Stacks of articles and clippings about Jeffrey Dahmer, Gary Ridgway, and other serial killers. One officer put it plainly. He either was just interested in serial killers or he was becoming one. But what brought Stephen Stanko to do something like this? Stephen was born on a military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and from the outside, it looked like discipline and structure were built into his life from the start. But the cracks began early. In 1983, at just 15 years old, Stephen lost his younger brother Billy in a house fire. Officially, the cause remained undetermined, and the case was never solved, but whispers of arson surrounded the tragedy. After that, something inside the family shifted. Stephen's father, once strict but present, pulled away devastated and angry. Eventually, he turned his back on Stephen altogether. Still, he had promise. At 17, he landed in the 85th percentile on the SAT with a 500 verbal and 620 math. His dream was to join the Air Force Academy. But when that dream was crushed in 1986 with a rejection letter, something in him broke. He tried community college and bounced between ideas, but nothing stuck. And not long after, the drifting turned to stealing, and that opened the door to something much darker. Then, in 1992, 24-year-old Stephen began dating Liz. And on the surface, he came off as charming, maybe a little odd, but nothing she couldn't live with. But then the lies started. Fake business ventures, stealing from neighbors, and sketchy behavior that never added up. And the more she asked questions, the more he dodged. Then came the night she woke up to him standing over her, silent, just watching. And before she could scream, he tried to smother her. She begged him to stop, told him she would never speak of it again if he left her alone. And surprisingly, he did, but only for a little while. On February 20th, 1996, everything exploded. He and Liz got into a violent physical fight. When it was over, she went to bed, exhausted and shaken. But hours later, she woke up to the strong smell of bleach. Stephen was standing over her with a soaked rag and attacked her out of nowhere. And not long after, cops showed up to find Liz tied up. Stephen was arrested and charged with kidnapping, and in April 1996, a grand jury indicted him on a long list of charges. Kidnapping, assault and battery with intent to kill, 9 counts of breach of trust with fraudulent intent, and 2 counts of obtaining property by false pretenses. He had taken a job at a car dealership, then turned around and stole both new and used cars, selling them off to Liz's neighbor. By the end of it all, Stephen was facing the full weight of it, 10 years in prison. And it all could have ended there. But for Stephen, it was only the beginning. In 2006, Stephen went to trial for Laura's murder. He pleaded insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty and sentenced him to death. And on top of that, he got 110 years for kidnapping and sexually assaulting Laura's daughter. Then, in 2009, he stood trial again, this time for Henry's murder. And this time, the verdict was the same. The jury found him guilty and gave him another death sentence. For years, Stephen fought to overturn the outcome. His lawyers filed appeal after appeal, arguing he had mental defects and that the courts didn't fully consider his age or cognitive issues. But the courts didn't budge. Every effort failed, both at state and federal level. Stephen would spend the next 20 years on death row. Then, on May 5, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition, and just 11 days later, the state set a date, June 13, 2025. Stephen had until May 30th to choose his method, electric chair, firing squad, or lethal injection. And at one point, he leaned toward the firing squad. He said it seemed quick, clean, but after reading what happened to Mikal Mahdi, Stephen started having second thoughts. Mikal had been the second man executed by firing squad in South Carolina this year, and on paper, the process sounded simple. 3 bullets, no blanks, fired straight to the heart. But when his legal team released the autopsy report, it told a different story. Only 1 bullet had pierced a heart chamber, and the others missed the vital points, which meant he didn't die quickly. His lawyers said he likely suffered for 3 or 4 times longer than expected, and witnesses reported hearing him groan 45 seconds after the shots were fired. And there were other issues. There was only 1 photo taken at Mikal's autopsy, and that one showed 2 wounds in his chest. Officials claimed 3 bullets were fired, saying 2 had entered through the same hole. But there were no X-rays, no clothing analysis, no ballistic trajectory tests. Nothing that would allow independent experts to verify these findings. This changed everything for Stephen, and just a few days later, he chose lethal injection instead. On Friday, June 13, 2025, Stephen's time ran out. Stephen ate his last meal on Wednesday as prison officials give inmates a chance to enjoy their special food before their execution day. He ate fried fish, fried shrimp, crab cakes, a baked potato, carrots, fried okra, cherry pie, banana pudding, and sweet tea. On his final evening, he was strapped to the gurney with 1 arm outstretched, where medical staff inserted an IV line to administer the lethal drug. Outside the prison, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Who would Jesus execute?" and "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." Inside, it was colder, quieter. The execution began after Stephen's attorneys read a 3.5-minute final statement. In it, Stephen apologized to his victims and asked not to be judged by the worst day of his life. "I am truly sorry for the pain and loss that I caused in this horrible situation." Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said. He also talked about how he was an honor student and athlete and a volunteer, and asked several times not to be judged by the night he killed 2 people. "I have lived for approximately 20,973 days, but I am judged solely for 1. He once again apologized to his victims and their families. "Once I am gone, I hope that Christina, Laura's family, and Henry's family can all forgive me. The execution may help them. Forgiveness will heal them." When the signal came, the prison officials asked for the first dose of the sedative pentobarbital. Stephen moved his lips, appearing to be saying words, and turned toward the families of the victims. He then let out several quick breaths as his lips quivered. He appeared to stop breathing after a minute. A prison employee asked for a second dose of pentobarbital about 13 minutes later. Stephen was pronounced dead at 6:34 p.m. Stephen Christopher Stanko was 57 years old. 11 days later, the next execution was scheduled. On June 24, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Thomas Lee Gudinas was executed by lethal injection in Florida. But before we talk about his final moments, let's look at what got him on death row in the first place. On May 23, 1994, Thomas Gudinas spent the night bar hopping through Orlando. He was 20, lived with 3 roommates, and they had started the evening the way they always did, with beer and weed at home before heading downtown. The nightclub they picked that night was Barbarella's, a popular spot known for its music and late-night crowd. Since Thomas wasn't allowed to drink yet, he used his cousin's ID that night at the bar, which was running a $5 all-you-can-drink draft special. Inside, they drank more, and every so often slipped out to keep their high going. But by the time the club shut down at 3 a.m., Thomas was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared into the dark. That same night, Rochelle Smith and her fiancé had showed up around 11 p.m. They danced, they drank, and around 2 a.m. they called it a night. Her fiancé stayed behind to say goodbye to friends, but Rochelle headed to the car, ready to go home. And that's when things turned. At first, she walked through the wrong parking lot, and that's where she saw him. A man crouched low behind a car watching her. Rochelle turned quickly and walked faster, trying to shake the feeling that she was being followed. She made it to the right lot, unlocked the door, slid into her car, and hit the lock button. But when she looked up into the rearview mirror, he was there again. The same man, but closer this time. He yanked on the passenger door, trying to force his way in, but it was locked. Then he circled around, crouched again, came around to her side, and tried the driver's door, also locked. That's when he snapped. "I want to f*** you," he shouted. He then covered his hand with his shirt and started smashing it into her window. Over and over. The glass held, but so did the panic. Rochelle slammed her hand on the horn. The sound pierced the quiet like a siren, and suddenly, the man froze and ran, vanishing into the shadows. But what Rochelle didn't know was that he didn't run far. He just hid and waited. And just an hour later, he saw his next chance. Michelle McGrath had also been at Barbarella's that night. She was 22, a recent college graduate with her whole life ahead of her. She was also there with her fiancé. And like Rochelle, Michelle left first to grab the car. But unfortunately, she didn't get as lucky, and somewhere between the club and the lot, she vanished. Her fiancé waited, then started looking. But she was gone. No one had seen her, and the parking lot offered nothing but silence. The next morning, Officer Chisari was on bike patrol in downtown Orlando when a man flagged him down, Culbert Presley. He had spotted a pile of clothes and some car keys lying near a parked car, a red Geo Metro. But before the officer could process what that meant, someone nearby screamed. Around 7 a.m., school employee Jane Brand had arrived at the Pace School. The courtyard behind the building was quiet, but then she noticed someone sitting on the steps. The man had his back to her, but he seemed young, maybe 18. He had short brown hair and a slouched posture, and at first glance he looked ordinary. Just an average-looking guy in baggy, dark shorts. But when Jane told him he couldn't be there, he didn't answer. He just stood up slowly, fumbling with the front of his shorts like he was tucking something in, or maybe doing something else. And then, without a word, he walked up the steps, climbed over the brick wall behind the school, and vanished down an alley. His behavior felt off. So Jane followed him into the alley, trying to figure out what he was doing. And that's when she saw her. Michelle McGrath, crumpled in the dirt, naked and lifeless. All her clothes were gone, except for her bra, which was pushed halfway up her chest. That's when Jane screamed. Meanwhile, Thomas ran back to Michelle's abandoned car. Her keys and clothes were still there. He grabbed them, climbed inside the red Geo Metro, and sped off, trying to get away before anyone could stop him. But the walls were already closing in. The moment the murder hit the news, Rochelle went straight to the police. She described the man who tried to attack her in vivid detail, and when they showed her a photo lineup, she didn't hesitate. She picked out Thomas Gudinas. And at trial, she pointed to him again. There was no doubt in her mind. It was him. Jane Brand, the Pace School employee who found Michelle's body, was shown the same lineup. At first, she hesitated. But later, she saw a clip on the news of Thomas walking, and everything clicked. She recognized the same figure she saw on the school grounds that morning, and again, it was Thomas Gudinas. And with this, the police had enough to arrest him. At his apartment, Thomas's roommates had already started noticing things. He didn't come home with them after the club that night, but by the next morning, he was back, covered in blood. His hands were torn up, his knuckles scraped raw, and his boxers were soaked in something dark. Blood. When they asked him what happened, Thomas claimed he had gotten into a fight with two African-American men. But it was what he said later that chilled them. One of his roommates had asked, half joking, half curious, if Michelle had been a good fuck. Thomas didn't flinch. He smiled, calm and unbothered. "Yeah," he said, "and I fucked her while she was dead." And another roommate heard him say it again, just as calm, just as cold. "I killed her, then I fucked her." So what led Thomas Lee Gudinas to do something that horrifying? His mother, Karen Goldthwait, tried to explain. She spoke of a pregnancy that nearly broke her and a birth that nearly killed him. And the first 6 months of Thomas's life were a blur of fevers, breathing problems, and endless doctor visits. And then came the rages. By the time he could walk, Thomas had tantrums that could last for hours. He didn't lash out at anyone, not yet, but all the screaming, the shaking, the wild-eyed fury made it clear something was wrong. At school, teachers flagged him as hyperactive and impossible to manage. One recalled him flipping chairs over in the middle of class, saying it was like a fuse inside him snapped anytime something didn't go his way. By the time he was 6, his mother brought him to Boston University for an evaluation. And soon after, she turned to the Massachusetts Division of Youth Services, desperate for help. But what followed was a blur of instability. Over the next several years, Thomas was moved through 105 different placements, and eventually, Karen was told he needed long-term residential care. But that never happened. In all that chaos, Thomas only made it through 4th grade in regular school. He earned a GED later, but his learning struggles were obvious, and he was eventually diagnosed with a low IQ of 85. Thomas started drinking when he was still a kid. Then it was weed, then cocaine. He even tried LSD, all long before he turned 18. At trial, his younger sister Michelle told the court what their house was like growing up. Their father once held Thomas's hand over an open flame to punish him for playing with matches. And another time, after he wet the bed, their dad forced him to stand outside half naked, holding a sign that read, "I will not wet the bed." Michelle added that things got better after the divorce, and Thomas even got along with their stepfather. But by then, the damage was already done. By the time the case reached court, the forensic evidence spoke louder than any witness ever could. The medical examiner, Dr. Heegert, testified that Michelle McGrath had died from massive head trauma, her skull crushed by what looked like a stomp from a heavy boot. Her brain had swelled, and the hemorrhaging killed her somewhere between 3 and 5 a.m. There were signs she fought back. Bruises and cuts on her hands made that clear. But it hadn't been enough. What followed was savage and deliberate. She was assaulted vaginally and anally with broken pieces of a stick, One fragment jammed 2 inches deep and another pushed in even farther. And it didn't end there. The forensic team found signs of additional trauma, pointing to a second object or attack. Thomas's bodily fluids, and with them his DNA, were found on her, and his fingerprints were discovered on the gate near the alley and inside her car. Then Thomas's own roommates testified against him. They had seen him at the club around 1 a.m., but when they headed home later, he was gone. And when he finally returned, he came back with blood on him, a half-baked story, and eventually, confessions. The evidence left little room for doubt, and the jury didn't hesitate. They found Thomas guilty on every count, and while he spent years insisting he suffered from bipolar disorder and severe mental illness, claiming he wasn't capable of rational intent when he killed Michelle McGrath, the court saw it differently, and 10 of 12 jurors voted for death. On June 16, 1995, a Florida judge sentenced Thomas to die for the first-degree murder of Michelle McGrath. He also received 30 years for attempted burglary with assault, 30 more for attempted sexual battery, and life for each count of sexual battery. Thomas spent the next 30 years on death row. With his execution scheduled for June 24, 2025, Thomas's lawyers made one last effort to stop the sentence. Just weeks before the scheduled date, they returned to the Florida Supreme Court with a new filing. They said Thomas suffers from serious mental illness, including psychosis and delusional thinking, and according to them, going through with the execution would violate the Eighth Amendment, which protects people from cruel and unusual punishment. The appeal asked the court to look not only at his mental state back when the crime happened, but also at how he is doing right now on death row. His lawyers argued that Thomas might not even understand why he's being punished anymore, which is a key legal requirement in death penalty cases. But it didn't matter, and the outcome stayed the same. On June 24, 2025, his final day came. That morning, Thomas woke up at 4:45 a.m. alone with his thoughts. He had just one visitor that day, his mother. No spiritual advisor, no final prayers, just silence and the slow ticking of time. For his last meal, Thomas requested a pepperoni pizza, fries, and a soda. When the curtain to the execution room opened at 6 p.m., Thomas already lay strapped to a gurney with an IV in his left arm, wearing a plain white shirt and dark pants. From a distance, he looked calm, with healthy color in his skin and no visible signs of fear or pain. When the curtain rose, Thomas was already scanning the witness room, his eyes moving slowly and his head turning just slightly. There was no spiritual advisor at his side. The warden finished his call with the governor's office and leaned in. He asked if Thomas had any final words. The microphone was too far away, and the hum of the air conditioning was too loud, so no one in the witness chamber could make out what he said. But a prison spokesman later shared that Thomas had made a quiet repentance and mentioned the name of Jesus. However, his exact words have not yet been released. When the drugs began to flow, Thomas's eyes began to roll back and his breathing shortened. After several minutes, he lost color in his face and fell still. He appeared unconscious. The usual checks followed. A guard leaned in, called his name, and flicked at his eyelid. But no response came. The signal was given, and then came the next 2 doses. After this, the prison warden announced that the sentence had been carried out. The curtain to the execution chamber closed, and witnesses were escorted out. At 6:13 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 51 years old. Just 1 day later, the final execution for June 2025 was carried out, this time in Mississippi. On June 25, 2025, after spending almost 50 years on death row, Richard Gerald Jordan was executed by lethal injection in Mississippi. Let's look at what he did. On the morning of January 12, 1976, 34-year-old Edwina Martyr kissed her kids goodbye and started her day like it was any other. But what she didn't know was that someone had already picked her family out. A stranger was watching her house, tracking her movements, and waiting for the right moment to strike. That stranger was 29-year-old Richard Gerald Jordan, a Vietnam veteran who had returned from 3 tours overseas with scars no one could see. By 1976, he was broke, unemployed, and buried in debt. He needed money, and fast. So he made a decision. He would kidnap someone from a wealthy family, demand a ransom, and disappear with enough cash to start over. He left Louisiana and headed for the Mississippi coast. But before crossing state lines, he stopped at a pawn shop in Baton Rouge and traded in his shotgun for a .38 caliber revolver. That was the last piece he needed. And when his parents asked where he was going, he lied, told them he was taking a physical for an offshore job. But he wasn't looking for work. He was hunting for a target. Once in Gulfport, he called the Gulf National Bank and asked for the commercial loan officer. They gave him a name, Charles Martyr, also known as Chuck. And with that, Richard hung up, flipped through the phone book, and found Chuck's home address. That afternoon, he drove straight there. He waited outside until most of the cars had left the driveway. Then he knocked on the door, and when Chuck's wife Edwina answered the door, Richard posed as a utility worker who needed to check the circuit breakers. Edwina's 3-year-old son was asleep in the house, and her other son, who was 10 years old, was already at school. Edwina let him in, not knowing that this would be her final act of kindness. Once inside, Richard pulled the gun and forced Edwina into the car. He made her leave her toddler behind, alone in the house, and then ordered her to drive deep into the DeSoto National Forest, where the roads narrowed and help was nowhere in sight. Once in the forest, Edwina, desperate to survive, tried to run. But Richard wasn't planning on letting her go just yet, and she didn't get far. Richard chased her down and made her stop. He warned her not to try that again, then led her a few steps deeper into the trees to a quiet patch of dirt under the pines. There, he told her to kneel. The ground was wet. Pine needles clung to her hands as she braced herself in the dirt. The forest around them was silent, holding its breath. Then Richard raised the gun, and without a word, he pulled the trigger. The shot entered at the base of her skull and exited just above her left eye. It was over in seconds. Edwina collapsed onto the forest floor and died right there. After the shooting, Richard tossed the revolver into the Big Biloxi River. Then, without a second thought, he called Chuck Martyr at the bank and told him that he kidnapped his wife, but she was alive and well, that if he ever wanted to see her again, he needed to pay $25,000 in ransom. Richard told him to wrap the money in brown paper and leave it on a blue jacket near Highway 49. But after he hung up, Chuck immediately contacted the FBI, and they came up with a plan. Chuck would follow Richard's instructions to the letter, and when Richard would show up to collect the money, agents would move in. So Chuck did exactly as told. He wrapped the cash in brown paper and looked for the blue jacket near the highway, just like Richard had said. But when he got there, there was no jacket. The drop was a bust. Richard wasn't stupid. He had been watching Chuck. He expected him to make a move, and the unmarked cars trailing him only confirmed his suspicion. So he decided not to leave the jacket on the location and called the whole thing off. But Richard wasn't done. He still wanted the money. So the next morning he called again. His voice was calm, measured. Again he told Chuck that Edwina was still alive, claimed she was asking about their sons, the 10-year-old at school and the toddler she had left sleeping in the house. He made it sound like she was okay, like there was still hope that she would return home. Then came the new instructions. He planned a different drop. Off the I-10 this time, and this time it came with a warning. No games, no tricks. If the FBI showed up, Chuck would never see his wife alive ever again. Richard thought that threat was enough to keep law enforcement away, and this time he did place the jacket. But Chuck didn't hesitate. He called the FBI again and laid everything out. Richard's new plan, the drop location, the timeline, and agents moved fast, trying to beat Richard there to catch him before he panicked and vanished again. But Chuck didn't wait. He drove out alone, just like before. And when he got there, the jacket was already there, just like Richard promised. Chuck didn't hesitate. He placed the bundle, $25,000, sealed tight, and walked away without looking back. Nearby, 2 agents were already waiting. They watched Richard show up, grab the cash, and take off. The chase was on in seconds. Richard swerved through traffic, forced the officers off the road, and somehow escaped while he was under fire. He ditched the car in a crowded shopping center and buried most of the money in the woods. Then he kept just enough to buy new clothes. He changed outfits, called a taxi, and tried to disappear. But he didn't get far. A roadblock stopped the car near the highway, and one of the officers recognized him right away. Richard didn't fight, and he was arrested without a single word of protest. In the hours that followed, he confessed to everything. He admitted that he had lied from the start, that Edwina had already been dead by the time he made the first ransom call. He told them where to find her body, where he had buried the weapon, the buried cash, the car, and the clothes he wore that day. He gave it all up. But how did it come to this? Richard was born in Hattiesburg and raised just down the road in Petal, Mississippi. He was adopted into a working-class family, one of several kids in a small, modest house. By most accounts, nothing about his childhood stood out. After high school, Richard joined the Army and didn't just serve. He volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War. He worked as a helicopter mechanic during the day, and when they went into combat, he took on one of the war's most dangerous roles, door gunner. He was firing from above, killing from the sky. And he saw everything: villages on fire, bodies in rice fields, friends who didn't come back. Vietnam didn't just change him, it broke something inside. And when he came home, he carried the weight in silence. He didn't talk about it. He couldn't. He was closed off, paranoid, and always scanning the room. He didn't sleep well and didn't trust anyone. Classic signs of PTSD, but in those days, no one called it that, and no one helped. Still, his loyalty to his country and family never wavered. When his tour in Vietnam ended, he volunteered to stay behind so his younger brother could go home in his place. By the mid-70s, Richard was back in the States, married and raising 3 kids. But civilian life didn't feel right. He struggled to find purpose outside the structure of the military and preferred being near bases where things still made sense. This created friction as his wife wanted to return home to Mississippi, but he didn't, and the marriage began to crack. He was broke, out of work, drowning in debt, and that's when everything collapsed. In 1976, Richard was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Edwina Martyr, but his life turned into a legal loop that wouldn't quit. At first, the trial in Harrison County moved fast. The jury didn't hesitate. They found him guilty and sentenced him to die. But his case landed in the middle of changing death penalty laws. The courts threw out his sentence, calling the process unconstitutional, and for a brief moment, his life was spared, but not for long. A year later, Richard went back on trial. The evidence hadn't changed, and neither had the outcome. This time, the process was split. First the verdict, then the punishment. But the jury came to the same conclusion both times. He was found guilty again and sentenced to death, a second time. Then came 1982, when the U.S. Court of Appeals stepped in. They ruled that the jury in his second trial never got proper instructions during the sentencing phase, and that the penalty phase had been flawed. Again, the court overturned his death sentence and ordered a new hearing. Another hearing, another shot at life. But the result in 1983 was the same: death row, round 3. The state affirmed it in 1985, but by the next year, the U.S. Supreme Court was back in the picture. A new ruling required juries to consider more about a defendant's background during sentencing, and because they hadn't, Richard's sentence was vacated, again. Tired of the cycle, Richard took a deal. He agreed to life without parole if the state skipped another penalty trial, but that too didn't hold. In 1994, the Mississippi Supreme Court ruled that life without parole wasn't even a legal option when Edwina was murdered. So that sentence, like all the others, was thrown out. Richard was sent back to court again. In 1998, More than 20 years after Edwina's death, he faced a jury for the 5th time. And this time, prosecutors didn't hold back. They said Richard had used the system for decades, dodging justice at every turn, that he deserved to die for what he had done. And this time, the jury didn't need long, just 35 minutes before handing him his 4th death sentence for the same crime. But even then, Richard kept fighting. He filed more appeals, chasing one last chance. But the court reviewed everything and ruled that his claims had no merit. And that was it. This time, the sentence stood. But even then, it would take another 27 years before it was carried out. For decades, Richard sat in a cell while the world outside changed. He grew old behind those walls and became the oldest, longest-serving death row inmate Mississippi had ever seen. But time didn't stop for him. He wrote short stories, took on prison jobs, and lived long enough to see the state's execution method change from gas chamber to lethal injection. But in the end, nothing stopped the clock. Right before his final day, Eric Martyr spoke up. Eric, now 60 years old, was just 11 when his mother was taken from him. Eric, his brother, and their father said they wouldn't be there to witness the execution. "It should have happened a long time ago," he said. "I'm not really interested in giving him the benefit of the doubt." Other family members chose to attend, but for Eric, the chapter had already closed. In the weeks leading up to the execution, a clemency petition was filed on Richard's behalf. It argued that his time in Vietnam had left deep psychological scars, that the trauma from 3 combat tours had changed him, and that the man who returned wasn't the same one who left. Franklin Rosenblatt, a military justice expert who helped prepare the petition, said that Richard's war history had never been fully considered in court. His war service, his war trauma, was considered not relevant in his murder trial, Franklin said. "We just know so much more than we did 10 years ago, and certainly during Vietnam, about the effect of war trauma on the brain and how that affects ongoing behaviors." But this didn't matter for the court, or for Eric. "I know what he did. He wanted money and he couldn't take her with him, so he did what he did." None of it changed what was coming. The sentence had been signed, the date set, and the final steps were already underway. On June 25, 2025, after spending nearly 50 years on death row, Richard's final day came. But the process had already begun 48 hours earlier. Like every scheduled execution in Mississippi, an inmate is quietly moved from Unit 29, known as Death Row, to Unit 17, a smaller holding area just steps from the execution chamber. And from that moment on, the clock started ticking. For Richard, those last 2 days were a blur of final moments. On the day of his execution, he spent time with the last people still standing by him, his lawyers, a handful of family members, and spiritual advisors. During the day, a prison official shared, "He's talking and appears to be in a good mood." He continued, "He's been telling stories. I've been with him a lot of the time, and so he's talking about his past and his history and things like that." The Mississippi Department of Corrections allowed his loved ones to stay with him until 4 p.m., the cutoff before the preparations began. That's when he was offered his final meal, for which he requested chicken tenders, fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. At 6 p.m., Richard was strapped to the gurney. The room was still. Observers sat behind the glass as staff moved through the final steps. Richard's wife, Marcia, witnessed the execution, along with his lawyer and a spiritual advisor. His wife and lawyer dabbed their eyes several times. When asked if he had any last words, Richard spoke clearly. "First, I would like to thank everyone for a humane way of doing this. I want to apologize to the victim's family." He also thanked his lawyers and his wife and asked for forgiveness. His last words just before the drugs flowed were, "I love you very much. I will see you on the other side, all of you." After the first injection, a staff member checked his consciousness. Once they confirmed he was no longer responsive, the rest of the process moved forward. By 6:16 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Richard Gerald Jordan was 79 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in June 2025. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.